Russia has been at war with Ukraine for over 34 months, and we want to look at the military situation today. I'm Julian Rupke, and this is BILD Situation Room. And we start again in the western Russian region of Kursk. For 4 days now, an offensive has been underway, so to speak, a double offensive. On one side, we have Ukrainian troops who are attempting to advance further north, moving even further away from their original Ukrainian border. On the opposite side, Russian troops are making attempts to encircle the entire area from every direction and aim to accomplish this before Donald Trump officially takes office on the 20th of January. And we have new material that confirms and shows us how far both armies, the Ukrainian and the Russian, have advanced in this effort. These video recordings originate from the start of the week and were officially released by the Russian side. They are supposed to show how so-called Stormzy troops, which are a type of people's militia, a sort of militia operating in conjunction with the Russian Ministry of Defense, supposedly consisting of volunteers who, of course, receive financial support from Moscow, and they were specifically deployed with the objective of recapturing the village of Berdyn. And Berdyn is in fact the village that the Ukrainian army courageously advanced on at the start of the week. We saw various videos of Ukrainian tank columns. We recall an armored recovery vehicle too moved away earlier, then various battle tanks and armored vehicles. Berdyn is the place that was traveled to, but so far we have had no evidence that the Ukrainian army has also reached Berdyn. Now we can see here, and indeed on the left side we can observe, these are all Russian soldiers who are move through Berdyn, through the snowy Berdyn, and try to carry out the ground counteroffensive there. Now we see it again in motion to execute the ground counteroffensive in Berdyn. That means these troops were deployed by the Russian side and, according to Russian reports, to retake Berdyn from Ukrainian troops. And this clearly demonstrates to us that the Ukrainian army has indeed advanced at least 6 kilometers during their ongoing offensive and has managed to temporarily take control of various parts of this particular village. Currently, we cannot say whether Ukrainian troops are still in the area. The Russians claim to have fully repelled the Ukrainians. There are recordings of dead Ukrainian soldiers. However, we don't have a complete picture, so we don't know if maybe only a part of Berdyn, the part we see here, now we can see the Russians running around there. This means there were indeed ground battles, even hand-to-hand combat. We also see this from other footage, as mentioned, some of which is very gruesome, showing gunshot wounds. Fatal gunshot wounds on Ukrainian soldiers. That fighting took place here on the ground. Nevertheless, this certainly proves that intense and fierce battles were fought on a very snowy, wintry terrain for new villages that Ukraine has never ventured into before. Before we take a look at the map, let's turn to another recording that reveals some very challenging situations or tough circumstances for Ukraine as we are currently situated here in Makhnovka. And Makhnovka is actually a neighboring suburb of Sudzha, which uniquely stands as the only small town currently remaining under Ukrainian control. And we can observe that the Russian army has apparently moved forward toward Makhnovka, which means they are attacking Sudzha on the ground coming from the eastern side and are now positioned at a distance of only approximately 1 kilometer from Sudzha. We see here various Russian soldiers on thermal imaging moving around. We observe here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 soldiers. That's all there is. It's also always important to note, even when it is said there are thousands of North Koreans involved. Conveniently, up to 100 individuals are deployed at a single place in just one day. These are still not larger dimensions that we're talking about. And right here below, we have the situation. This is again a Russian recording where Ukrainian defenders are sitting in Makhnovka. The Ukrainians open fire on the Russian soldiers who evade the attack by moving quickly into nearby houses for cover. You could certainly say they're retreating. Nevertheless, the Russian army is strategically presenting it as a tactical maneuver by their highly trained soldiers in Makhnovka to advance cautiously and systematically. And the reports we currently have suggest that Makhnovka is actually at least half under Russian control, which would mean that the area controlled by Ukraine east of Sudzha actually keeps getting smaller. Let's take a quick look at the footage. On the map, we would like to examine what we just saw in the video and take a closer look at it. That it is getting harder, especially for the Ukrainian army, to hold the area. Here in Sudzha, as mentioned, the town with 6,000 inhabitants, the only one under Ukrainian control since August of last year. And we see the footage from Makhnovka just now, very, very close to Sudzha. We can see that up there. And if we look at the distance in kilometers, it's only about 2 to 3 kilometers that the Russian army is still away from Sudzha. It's the essential logistics hub for the Ukrainians in this entire region. If Sudzha is lost, then the surrounding villages can't be held either. And at the same time, we just saw the footage from Berdyn, and this footage is basically here at the end of the light blue area. We remember dark blue is firmly controlled by the Ukrainian army, light blue is contested. The Ukrainians have reportedly tried to advance towards Bolshoye Soldatskoye. We don't know if that was really the intended goal. Regardless, they got stuck about halfway, eventually reaching Berden, and there was some fighting in that area for several days. As mentioned, we don't currently know the situation. Lastly, we want to take a look at footage from Sverdlikovo. They are another village here, also under Ukrainian control. And there we see once again what we've experienced in the past few days, namely that Russia is now using heavy bombs, heavy air bombs, to bomb its own villages and cities, to oust Ukraine's army from there. We'll let the video run for now. And we can now see another large explosion occurring right in the center of Sverdlikovo. It's hard to fully see, but this is clearly the village's main street with rows of houses on both of its sides. In the center, you can distinctly notice the impact left by a Russian FAB 500 or an even heavier bomb, which is directly dropped onto the very heart of the Ukrainian-occupied village located in the region of Kursk. So that represents the current situation in Kursk, located in the western region of Russia. We are merely 2 weeks away from the inauguration ceremony of Donald Trump. And as I mentioned, Russia is indeed doing quite a lot to push Ukraine away from here. Ukraine has once again tried to take the initiative in recent days by advancing forward itself. However, it does seem that this particular offensive has more or less fizzled out, or at least has been restricted to around 5 kilometers. A village has indeed been reached, which could now potentially be under Russian control once again. We head from the west of Russia to the east of Ukraine to take a look at the situation in the major battle zones, namely around Kharkov and around Pokrovsk, where the Russian army is trying to advance from Donetsk into the center of Ukraine, to the Dnepropetrovsk region. Additionally, we have new footage that clearly demonstrates to us exactly how this advance is taking place. First, we see footage from the small village of Vozdvizhenka, which we looked at a few days ago. Vozdvizhenka is extremely contested because it is located on an important connecting road, namely between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, and then Chasiv Yar behind it, and this connecting road runs only a few hundred, or rather a few kilometers north from here. We see footage showing us that the Russian army tried to advance on this connecting road, and apparently all the vehicles that were used for that, namely at least 1 main battle tank and 2 infantry fighting vehicles that unfortunately ended up being destroyed in and around the area of Vozdvizhenka. Here we see the village remains heavily contested as mentioned. The Ukrainians are working hard to prevent the Russian army from advancing further from here towards, I believe T0504 is the name of the connecting road, and we can see now that various Russian vehicles have been burned both in the town and north of the town. When they attempted to seize control of this connecting road, which would represent yet another significant blow to the logistics of the Ukrainians, who need to travel daily between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. Let's take a quick look at the situation on the map. We will take another look at the Pokrovsk map once or twice. And the situation we have just observed originated up here, as I mentioned earlier, in Vozdvizhenka, and presently we can see this orange area gradually moving further and further in the northward direction. To the west, what we have just seen is the key leading point or spearhead of the Russian advance in that area. And we observe it's just about, well, roughly 2 kilometers to 3 kilometers to the connecting road T0504. Which then extends further towards Konstantinivka. We are remaining for now in the Pokrovsk region. Look a bit further to the west because we can see the large Ukrainian city. 65,000 people formerly still reside here, remain untouched, at least on the ground. The Russians have already managed to flank the city in the south. We just spoke about the situation in the northeast. But we also need to talk about the situation here at the westernmost end of the front, if you will. Because here we can see it relatively well on the map. We have marked it even better this time. We have this dashed line that moves along here. And this is the oblast border. And we've mentioned repeatedly in the last few days that a possible goal of the Russian army is to reach this oblast border. And not just to achieve the goals set out by Putin, namely complete annexation and control of the Donetsk region, but also to further humiliate Ukraine and bring the war to the center of the country. And as we can see here, Novovasilivka is the current front location. That means the Ukrainians are putting up heavy resistance there. The Russians have been held back there for almost a week now, unable to advance from that point. However, we have recently received new footage from a tiny village situated halfway length halfway right between the oblast border to Dnipropetrovsk and the current front. And this village is located south of the road and is called Novo Oleksandrivka. And we are now seeing footage from this place showing us that the Russians have already managed to, using their, if you will, advanced super drone, specifically their fiber optic guided drone, to already make advancements forward from the front lines, so to speak, and target the final Ukrainian defense positions between the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and the current front line here. We take a look at the footage and see that it's very shocking because it shows us that the Russian drones are here in Novo Oleksandrivka, just 4 kilometers away from the current front line, maneuver themselves directly into the vehicles, the entryways, the homes, and the military trucks of the Ukrainian defenders, where they can then explode right there. And that's clearly a big problem for the Ukrainian defenders who don't even have safe retreat zones, not even where they've set up positions with residential buildings, have moved and are residing there now. The civilians from here have fled, heading towards the west. And we see that these trucks are parked between the residential buildings. We see that these are basically Ukrainian occupied houses, if you will, requisitioned by the army, legal of course. During their stay there, compensation is provided, they said, for the residents who have just fled to Kiev or to Germany. And we see, however, that the Russian drones, because they are equipped with fiber optics, yes, are operated because they are monitored from a distance, allowing them to move relatively freely just 4 kilometers away from the border of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, targeting and observing the various Ukrainian vehicles as well as the different houses. We also notice few damages here so far, as the front advanced there swiftly, able to engage. We now see this example here. Presumably one must say maybe it's a civilian, but presumably it's a civilian vehicle belonging to a military member. Next to it, the military has settled to fight just 3 kilometers further east. And here we can see the very precise attacks by the Russian army, which are currently taking place just 3 kilometers from the Oblast border towards Dnipropetrovsk, using fiber optic guided drones. The whole situation is really difficult for the Ukrainians, and we also see that the Russians are not only interested in, as we will take a look now, they are not only interested in to encircle Pokrovsk and attack from all sides, but there is quite obviously, as we have just seen, an additional attack direction also to the west, while they naturally try to advance further here and attack Pokrovsk from various directions over time, employing this pincer tactic that has worked so well for the Russian army so often to apply to this big city as well. And we have the latest figures stating that approximately 7,000 of the 65,000 residents in Pokrovsk are still holding out. Some of them hope to be defended by Ukraine. We ourselves visited the city about 3 months ago. Some say we'll hold out here until the last moment and we're sitting on packed belongings. And others, to be honest, from about 10% of the population who are still there, some of them are also waiting for the Russian army because they are pro-Russian. We are moving somewhat further to the south, specifically into the Kharkov region, and here we have obtained new images that once more effectively demonstrate the vast number and significant mass of the weapon systems being deployed by the Russian army to capture one of these small villages. We often see Russian flags raised in these villages, here again by the 114th Brigade, but we don't often see what happens before. And of course, it's not that the Ukrainian army is running away here, but they put up fierce resistance, is, however, numerically and even somewhat in terms of weaponry at a disadvantage. We have some trench systems here around Shevchenko, a place a few kilometers west of Kurakov. And we can now see how the Russians first spy on everything, closely examining where the few Ukrainian defenders are, and then immediately targeting them with various weapons, primarily from drones. Here we see not only soldiers, but also heavy weapon systems, in this case a weapon system from Germany, specifically a Leopard 1 tank. The federal government provided 103. Yet we see Ukraine using them in a manner that unfortunately results in many weapons being lost. In particular, individual heavy tanks are being repositioned to specific front sections to perform predominantly defensive tasks and duties there. Here we have yet another Leopard 1 tank that has fallen victim to the Russian attacks near Shevchenko, as previously mentioned, in Donetsk. 1 out of 103 delivered by the German side. However, we can also observe throughout the course of the video the comprehensive range of measures being executed by the Russian army to be effectively active in this area. We are witnessing all the grenades being dropped on various positions, and we're observe, of course, pixelated then, how these grenades hit and directly strike the few Ukrainian defenders with a fair amount of precision. We can also see that other drones are deployed, not just these, but And here we can pause at the right moment. So these are fixed-wing drones, in other words, relatively modern kamikaze drones, which are also deployed. This means the Russians are definitely not just using old ammunition or only quadcopters, but as we've seen, they have heavy drones that drop grenades, and they have these fixed-wing ones that have the capability to fly in with a relatively high explosive power into specific Ukrainian military positions. Now we can observe how Ukrainian soldiers are maneuvering through the trenches and actively facing attacks in that area. And next we see very heavy explosions also in Shevchenko. Here we see it. This means the Russians rely not only on high tech, but also on the sheer massive firepower of their artillery and their multiple rocket launchers. We'll take a closer look at that in a moment. Here we see different impacts. This is a multiple rocket launcher that also hits the area of Shevchenko. This implies that the few Ukrainian soldiers present here must confront a whole range of weapon systems, from very small, modern, precise ones to very large ones from the Cold War era. Facing them, exposed to them. And here we can see it again quite well. Each of these small black dots we see, that's always an impact crater created by the bombardment. And those are, of course, only the ones that missed. We know that the Grad missile launchers and so on have a very wide dispersion. That means we are now seeing all the craters from rocket impacts that didn't hit houses. But we can clearly see that none of these houses around here have a roof left anymore. It's all been destroyed. On the right side too, this shows there was heavy shelling here and Ukrainians tried to hold out for quite a while. Nevertheless, in the end, the Russians successfully managed to seize control of this town. Yes, this small spot as well. We observed another fixed-wing aircraft launching an attack here. In the meantime, we see time and again how the Ukrainians make efforts to do something using individual armored vehicles and a small number of soldiers against the Russian invaders, however. Once again in vain in this case. Now we are witnessing another fascinating scene unfold. Over the past few months, we have often mentioned that drones are being used more and more frequently as a strategic means to destroy the opponent's drones. And here we observe a Ukrainian drone commonly referred to as the Baba Yaga drone. This is a larger 6-rotor aerial vehicle which is remotely controlled from another location. But that is capable of dropping multiple grenades, specifically aimed at Russian soldiers. We are currently observing how one of these large drones, which costs approximately 10,000 euros, is being targeted and attacked by a Russian drone, leading to it being effectively brought down. Here, as I mentioned earlier, more drone strikes, and at the end, we see what we frequently observe, the red flag now of the very Soviet-influenced 114th Brigade of the Russian Army is now hoisted over the destroyed ruins of Shevchenko, a location that has become completely depopulated. But then with heavy losses both for the Russian army, which of course you don't see in the propaganda videos, and for the Ukrainian army, as we just saw, was just captured by the Russian army. Now let's take a look at the outcome of this entire lengthy video we just watched, as presented on the map. And there, it is relatively unspectacular, but it is something that has repeated itself dozens of times in the past weeks, and unfortunately, this leads to a very dramatic situation for Ukraine. What we saw were all recordings from this small region. That means this tiny village with a few hundred residents was essentially attacked from the eastern side by the Russian army. The Ukrainians repeatedly tried to defend it from the west and the north with their individual tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and soldiers who were sent there. Nevertheless, in the end, they ultimately lost it. And now we observe this incredibly difficult situation. This is Andrivka, which is the next small town after Kursk, where the Ukrainians are trying to organize their defense. And this Andrivka, as we can clearly observe on the map up there, it currently stands at roughly about 3 kilometers away from the front line. And I clearly recall that back in September when we were on the ground there, the distance was still more than 20 kilometers as the front line had been situated approximately in this area. And you can already observe that the Russians are making progress at the moment in this region, advancing about 5 or 6 kilometers per month across a wide front, not individually. They've advanced much further here, but across a broad front. They move about 5-6 kilometers per month to the west, thus also threatening Andreevka next. And that Ukrainian soldiers are also defending on the ground and not just from the air, not only with drones. We can see that in the following footage showing the relatively heroic actions of 2 Ukrainian soldiers in a village occupied by Russian soldiers. Here we see that a total of 2 soldiers, one here and one here, are active in a completely destroyed village that has already been occupied by Russians. Interestingly enough, the Russians have now hidden themselves here, in this basement that we can see here. Here we see a cellar entrance, and inside are the Russian soldiers who are currently resting. We observe a Ukrainian dropping a substantial bag filled with, as we've just seen, a considerable amount of explosive materials directly onto the cellar entrance and then swiftly moving away from the scene. And this bag is also equipped with a remote detonator. This means the drone operator can now precisely monitor when the Russians, who are hiding there, enter the bunker. You can't know how many are there. We've seen 2 Ukrainians, 3 or 10 Russians could be inside. When precisely will the Russian soldiers come out from there to potentially continue their forward movement after having taken some rest and sleep inside? And this situation is now becoming imminent as we start to recognize that the Russian soldiers are finally making an appearance for the first time, signaling their intention to come out and undertake further offensive maneuvers. And now this big green bag, which was just placed there by the Ukrainians, explodes, and accordingly, this leads to relatively large losses for the Russians hiding inside there. So it can be seen that there are still fights on the ground between Ukrainian defenders and Russian attackers, but we see that there are very few Ukrainians who are fighting on the front line as infantry against the Russians there, who are simply being sent there, let's be honest, just to die, which reflects a very different view of what a soldier's role is. The Russians say we sacrifice soldiers until we achieve our goals. The Ukrainians say we want to sacrifice as few soldiers as possible and still survive as a nation. We are going to take a look at additional footage of North Korean backing. In recent weeks, it has primarily been noticed by soldiers on the ground in Kursk. However, we have recently obtained new footage indicating that large North Korean artillery guns are not only making their way to Ukraine, but these weapons have also reached the point of being actively utilized at the front. We are talking about the Kursk cannon, which was developed in the 70s. Thus, it is considered relatively modern by North Korean standards, a self-propelled vehicle. Essentially a large artillery gun on tracks. We first briefly see here, as proof, so that's the artillery gun, clearly visible, and here we see a train of the Russian railway. That means in recent weeks it has been observed that these heavy artillery pieces are being transported on Russian trains thousands of kilometers westward to be deployed in Europe. Interestingly, there is hardly any reaction from the European side, even to a clear North Korean attack with heavy weapons and thousands of soldiers on Europe. But that's just a side note. And now we see these recordings from Ukraine. We see that the Kursk has now established itself with its 170mm gun. By the way, it's quite interesting here, which also proves that we're dealing with the same artillery. This marking here, N2200, is a marking used by the Russian railway for heavy systems designed for heavy loads that require transportation, probably weighing over 2.2 tons, have to be moved carefully. And these markings already revealed in 2014 that these were not separatist tanks or Ukrainian tanks, but rather Russian army tanks advancing in eastern Ukraine. Because it was plainly evident that the Russians, or whoever is behind orchestrating the entire operation, didn't even bother to remove the markings from the Russian railway. That means we see quite clearly that until recently this Kursk gun from North Korea was on a Russian train and has now taken up fixed positions in the east of Ukraine. The principal issue is that these guns can reportedly fire a distance of up to 40 kilometers. As mentioned, 170mm. It's a powerful warhead being transported. And that could be another problem for Ukraine. However, and it's also important to note, Ukraine is not defenseless against these big guns. And we can see that through these recordings here, which were also released by the Ukrainian army in this case. We see here a Pion artillery gun 2S7 from the Soviet Union, now part of the Russian army, and they are very similarly constructed. It's a self-propelled artillery system that has a range of approximately 40 kilometers. Depending on the load they carry, Ukrainian Baba Yaga drones can fly 20, 30 or 40 kilometers beyond the front lines, allowing them to strategically deploy grenades on specific targets. This significantly extends their operational reach and impact in modern warfare scenarios. To drop this very howitzer, we see that it's repeatedly attacked, we see the night explosions, and we see that even these howitzers, with their 40 kilometers range, are now becoming modern threats. This applies both to the Panzerhaubitze 2000 on the Ukrainian side and to the Pion or the Kursk, which we have just seen on the Russian side, that these large guns, heavy artillery, if they realize, if they notice, and don't shoot and scoot, meaning go, fire, and quickly leave. But when the operators or the leadership of the Russian army believes they can securely position the weapon there, as we have observed in these instances, then it gets relatively easy, once they have been identified and located, for any type of hostile drones to effectively target and launch attacks on them there. Finally, let's take another look over at Russia. There was once again a large Ukrainian drone assault there last night, and here we can observe the drones actively in action. This is footage captured up here from another Luty drone. At least 2 of these drones were deployed specifically against the Engels Air Force Base near Saratov, which is about 600 kilometers away from the border with Ukraine. We're observing how these drones are flying over the local people in Saratov, making their way towards an oil depot or a fuel depot that is situated at the airport. Now we see the impacts here, at least 2 following each other, at the military airport in Saratov named Engels hitting. And now we witness the fires that ignited there throughout last night, approximately around 1 o'clock in the local time zone. And due to drone strikes coming from the Ukrainian direction, most likely originating from Ukrainian territory itself. And we can see that these fires have continued burning until this morning. That means Ukraine continues to attempt to strike strategic targets in Russia while defending its own country. And yet again, this military base, situated 600 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border, has turned into the target of Ukrainian long-range drones during the night.